They never had to say, "Obey me." You just did. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that obedience felt safer than rejection. You didn't fear punishment. You feared the look in their eyes, the quiet withdrawal, the way they could make the whole room feel cold because you said no. Guilt wasn't an emotion. It was the leash, invisible, ever present, and worse, internalized. Let me ask you something. When did you first feel bad for having your own needs? Was it when you wanted space? When you asked for more? Or when you stopped performing, even just for a second, and they made you feel like you just betrayed them? That wasn't guilt. That was programming. You weren't just taught to behave. You were trained to self-police. You monitored your tone, your volume, your timing, not because you were unkind, but because you knew the cost of misstepping. They didn't have to punish you. They just had to withdraw approval and watch you spiral into apology. This is how narcissistic control works, not through violence, but through emotional conditioning. They shape your morality not around right or wrong, but around what protects their comfort. And so guilt became your reflex, the moment you put yourself first, the moment you stopped accommodating. You didn't feel empowered. You felt wrong. Because you weren't just avoiding conflict. You were trying to preserve the illusion that their love was safe. You thought, if I do everything right, I'll finally feel worthy. But worth was never on offer. Only silence, shame, or compliance. And when guilt is the price of survival, you learn to betray yourself just to feel like you belong. So ask yourself, whose comfort are you still protecting by staying small? Whose rules still echo in your chest every time you try to set one of your own? This isn't about blame. It's about liberation. Because guilt is only powerful when you believe it means something. But what if it doesn't? What if the guilt you carry was never yours to begin with? Because the real question isn't why you feel guilty. It's who made you believe that guilt meant you were bad, just for choosing yourself. Let's go there. Guilt can be healthy. In its natural state, guilt is your nervous system's compass. It alerts you when you've stepped out of alignment with your values, when your actions harm others or violate something sacred within you. But that's not the kind of guilt we're talking about here. Because trauma-based guilt doesn't arise from your morals. It arises from someone else's control. This guilt doesn't say, I made a mistake. It says, I am a mistake, unless I do what they want. And that's not conscience. That's conditioning. In narcissistic family systems, guilt is introduced early, not as a natural consequence of harm, but as a punishment for autonomy. Wanting privacy? You're withholding, expressing pain. You're too sensitive. Saying no, you're selfish, ungrateful, or worse, the problem. It didn't matter what you actually did. It only mattered whether they approved. And when a child's entire emotional ecosystem is based on approval, guilt becomes the currency of survival. So you learned to feel guilty for existing outside of their expectations. And here's the cruel twist. They convinced you that guilt meant you were growing, that the discomfort you felt was a sign you were becoming a better person. But really, you were just learning to disappear faster. Let's go deeper. Freud called this the development of the superego, the internalized voice of parental judgment. For most people, the superego is shaped by boundaries, empathy, and repair. But in narcissistic homes, it's shaped by distortion. Instead of a conscience that guides, you're left with a critic that punishes. And so you live with a voice in your head that sounds like you, but feels like them. A voice that doesn't just ask, "Is this right?" It hisses, "Who do you think you are?" Carl Jung takes it further. He said that what we don't make conscious, we project into the shadow. And for many adult children, that shadow is guilt. Guilt that doesn't belong to them. Guilt that was projected onto them by parents who never processed their own shame. You were taught to feel guilty for your boundaries because they felt abandoned when you stopped being easy to control. You were taught to feel guilty for your truth because they mistook disagreement for betrayal, and you were taught to feel guilty for walking away because your absence made them confront a mirror they spent years avoiding. Pause here. Ask yourself, when did you first feel like your needs were selfish? Who taught you that saying no meant you were hurting someone? What version of you did you have to silence to keep the peace? These aren't rhetorical questions, they're trauma tracers. Because the guilt you feel today didn't start in adulthood. It started the first time your selfhood made someone else uncomfortable, and they used guilt to put you back in line. But here's the truth. That wasn't guilt. It was emotional blackmail disguised as morality. And you didn't internalize it because you were weak. You internalized it because your nervous system was wired for attachment over authenticity. You didn't choose guilt. You inherited it. And now, your healing begins by asking, who am I when I stop apologizing for existing? But if the guilt was never mine, why does it still feel so real when I walk away? Let's expand on that. When a narcissistic parent loses control, they don't blame their behavior. They blame your ingratitude. Because the narcissistic parent doesn't just weaponize guilt through criticism, they use martyrdom as a shield. I did everything for you. I gave up my life. After all I've sacrificed. It sounds like love. It's actually a ledger, because every diaper changed, every meal made, every roof provided wasn't offered as care. It was banked as debt. And one day, they came to collect. This is the quiet trauma of emotional debt, where normal parenting responsibilities are reframed as acts of sainthood. And you, the child, are cast as the ungrateful sinner. Your needs become burdens, your boundaries, betrayals, and your growing independence, an act of war. You weren't disobedient. You were inconvenient. You had thoughts, preferences, wants, and those didn't serve their script, because the narcissistic parent's identity is built on a story. I was the perfect parent. If my child suffers, it's because they failed me. And you were forced to carry the contradiction, to play the good child in a play you didn't audition for, just to protect the illusion of their perfection. Let's unpack that further. Martyrdom is not selflessness. It's control disguised as sacrifice. When a parent constantly reminds you of what they gave up, they're not nurturing you. They're manipulating you. They create an emotional scoreboard. And no matter how much you give back, you're always losing. You spend your life trying to repay a debt you never agreed to. You call more, visit more, soften your voice, mute your boundaries, and still they find a way to make you feel like the problem. Because for the narcissistic parent, the appearance of suffering is power. It garners sympathy. It garners control. And most of all, it silences you. Pause here. Ask yourself, when did love start to feel like owing someone something? Who taught you that your freedom meant their failure? What version of gratitude have you been performing just to avoid guilt? Because here's the truth. You didn't betray them by growing up. You didn't hurt them by creating space. You simply stopped playing the part they wrote for you. And for the parent who demands lifelong loyalty, your healing looks like rebellion. Not because you're cruel, but because you're finally choosing truth over performance. But what happens when you finally try to break free, not just physically, but emotionally? What happens when you stop returning the guilt? Keep listening. This is where it begins to shift. Let's talk about punishment. Not the kind that leaves bruises, the kind that rewires your nervous system until safety means self-abandonment. Because for children of narcissistic parents, boundaries were never allowed, not emotionally, not energetically, not even silently. And over time, even thinking no started to feel like betrayal. This is how guilt gets somatic, when your parent sighed instead of screamed, when they shut down instead of showing up, when they said, "I guess you don't care. After all I've done for you, fine, do what you want." They didn't raise their voice. They lowered the temperature until you froze. Because for a child, that withdrawal is a threat, not just to comfort, but to connection. So what did you do? You fawned. You apologized for having needs. You over-explained. You reached for closeness, even when it cost you yourself. This isn't just emotional, it's neurobiological. Your nervous system learned connection equals survival. Disappointment equals danger. When you tried to say no, your body said, "You'll lose them." When you expressed pain, your body said, "You'll hurt them." When you pulled away, your body said, "They'll never come back." And so you didn't pull away. You got quieter, softer, smaller. Because in that household, boundaries weren't seen as protection. They were seen as punishment. Not for you, for them. This is how they reverse the reflex. Your pain becomes their weapon. Their suffering becomes your leash. They get to be fragile. You get to be the fixer. They break connection, and you're the one who glues it back together. They never needed to scream to control you. They just needed to sigh. They didn't need to hit you. They just needed to hurt when you left. And somewhere along the way, you internalized the belief, if I cause them pain, I must be the problem. Let's pause. When did you start treating your needs like weapons? Who taught you that space meant selfishness? Can you remember the first time you felt bad for doing what was right for you? Because this is the silent cost of trauma-bonded guilt. You weren't afraid of losing them. You were afraid of disappointing them. You were scared of becoming the villain in their story, even when they were the ones writing it with shame. And here's the twist. They punished your boundaries so you would never learn what safety actually feels like. They taught you that your freedom was violence and their control was care. But the moment you stop fawning, the moment you stop apologizing for being whole, you'll see something clearly. You never needed their permission. You needed your own protection. But what happens when you finally name the manipulation? How does the guilt loop keep you performing? That's next. Let's talk about the leash. Not the kind you see, but the one you feel. The invisible tether that keeps you answering messages you don't want to reply to. Attending family dinners that leave you drained. Saying, "I'm fine," when you're not. Because even when you try to walk away, the guilt follows you. Why? Because for children of narcissistic parents, guilt wasn't a signal. It was a script. And your role? The fixer? The peacekeeper? The one who understood. Here's the neurobiology of that loop. When you're raised in emotional enmeshment, your nervous system wires safety to their regulation. You didn't just survive by being quiet, you survived by anticipating their moods, by scanning for tension, by managing their pain before it turned into yours. In other words, you became their emotional regulator. You knew when they were about to spiral. You learned how to soothe them before they exploded or collapsed. And somewhere along the way, their chaos became your compass. So now, even years later, when they text, when they guilt trip, when they cry, you feel the urge to respond. Not because you owe them, but because your body still believes you do. This is the guilt loop. It doesn't ask, "Is this healthy?" It asks, "Am I safe if they're upset with me?" Because your worth was never independent. It was tied to their stability, their happiness, their story. You weren't a child, you were a mirror, reflecting back their fantasy, absorbing all the cracks they refused to face. Let's pause here for reflection. Have you ever felt bad for setting a boundary? Do you feel responsible for their sadness, even when you're not the cause? Can you recall a moment where saying no felt like an act of betrayal? Now let's deepen this with a metaphor. Picture an invisible leash, not around your neck, but around your nervous system. Every time you try to step away, it tugs, not violently, just enough to make you second guess. Maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe I should just keep the peace. And so you perform. You stay quiet. You stay agreeable. You stay available. Because the leash doesn't punish you. It confuses you. It makes you think guilt is a moral compass, when really, it's just a map of your trauma. If you don't recognize the guilt loop, you'll call it love. You'll call it duty. You'll call it being a good daughter, or being the bigger person. And you'll stay trapped in the cycle, performing for people who never saw you. But here's the open wound. Even if you break contact, even if you go silent, even if you reclaim your peace, the guilt still whispers, you abandoned them. Why? That's where we're going next. Because the leash wasn't just around your nervous system. It was wrapped around your identity. And to sever it, you have to grieve who you thought you had to be. They're not in the room anymore. You moved out. You blocked the number. You said the final words you were never allowed to say as a child. But somehow they're still here. Not in body, but in voice. The sigh, the eye roll, the cold silence that used to follow your boundaries. It lives on, in your head. And that's the thing about emotional enmeshment. Even when the relationship ends, the voice remains. Psychologists call this an introject, a voice you internalized so deeply you mistake it for your own. That sharp tone that says, "You're selfish for needing space." That guilt-slick whisper, "You're too much. You're hurting them." That sarcastic echo, "Guess you think you're better than your family now." And you don't hear it as them. You hear it as you. You became your own captor. Let's take a moment to reflect. Whose voice are you afraid to disappoint, even now? When you make a decision for your peace, who do you imagine disapproving of it? What story plays in your head when you say no? The scariest part, that voice doesn't yell. It reasons, it gaslights, it justifies your suffering in the language they taught you. They're still your parents. They did their best. You're the only one causing problems. And so you second guess, not because you are unsure, but because your nervous system learned to distrust peace. Silence isn't soothing, it's suspicious. Stillness doesn't mean freedom, it means danger's coming. So here's the question. What if your inner critic isn't yours? What if it's just the echo of someone else's shame, someone else's rage, someone else's inability to face their own reflection? Because that's the cruel trick of narcissistic parenting. They don't just control you while they're present. They teach you to control yourself when they're gone. You inherited their lens. You speak in their shadows. And the only way to reclaim yourself is to ask, who am I without their voice in my head? This is not about blame. This is about clarity. You didn't develop these thoughts. You absorbed them. You didn't choose self-betrayal. You learned it was safer than being seen. You didn't become a people pleaser. You were trained to be the person who keeps the peace, even if it costs your sanity. And here's where the loop starts to crack. Once you can see that voice as separate, you can start to rewrite the script. But that won't happen in a day, because guilt doesn't just vanish, it detangles, and you are not failing for still hearing them. You are healing because you finally know it's not you. Up next, what happens when you finally drop the guilt? How do you rebuild and rewire the guilt glitch in your system? You were taught that guilt meant you did something wrong. But what if guilt just means you've stopped following someone else's script? Let's be clear. This isn't the guilt of wrongdoing. It's the guilt of rebellion. Because when your life has been shaped around someone else's comfort, choosing your own becomes an act of war. Not externally. Internally. Your nervous system revolts. Your mind glitches. Your conscience whispers, turn back. Apologize. Fix it. But this time, there's nothing to fix, except the script. This kind of guilt isn't moral, it's mechanical. It's the emotional residue of a system that was built around control, not connection. You were raised in an economy where affection had currency, where your compliance was the price of admission. And guilt was the invoice. Think about it. Who taught you that saying no was selfish? Who made you believe that choosing differently meant hurting them? Who framed your boundaries as betrayals? They didn't shout. They didn't need to. They sighed. They withdrew. They played the victim. And you compensated. That wasn't kindness. That was programming. Let's pause for a moment. When did you start apologizing just for existing differently? What invisible rules still shape how you make decisions? How much of your guilt is yours, and how much is inherited? This is the part no one tells you. You're not healing guilt. You're reassigning it, because it was never yours to begin with. Kafka wrote, "The chains of habit are too light to be felt until they are too heavy to be broken. Guilt is the chain. It tightens when you grow and loosens when you finally say, 'This was never love.' This was leverage. So here's the reframe, in full clarity. If guilt shows up every time you choose peace, then guilt has been corrupted. It's no longer a moral compass. It's a trigger, installed by repetition, reinforced by silence, held in place by the illusion that their disappointment defines your worth. But what if it doesn't? What if guilt isn't a warning sign, but a withdrawal symptom? You're not betraying anyone. You're detoxing. Let's call it what it is. Guilt is grief in disguise. Grief for the life you didn't get. Grief for the identity you had to perform. Grief for the illusion you're finally leaving behind. You can feel it, but you don't have to follow it. So ask yourself, what parts of your life are still built to avoid guilt instead of choosing freedom? Because if you don't reclaim that space, someone else will. And right when you begin to heal, they come knocking again. But not to reconnect, to reassert the contract. And that's what we're confronting next. You weren't selfish. You were systemically silenced. Every time you tried to speak your truth, they handed you a guilt trip. Every time you stood your ground, they said you were too much. And every time you got close to breaking free, they reminded you who you were supposed to be. But you're not here to stay small. You're not here to parent your parents, to patch their broken egos, to dim your light just so theirs can flicker a little longer. You're here to become whole, and that means walking through guilt and not turning back. Jung called it individuation, the sacred process of becoming who you truly are, even when the world around you wants you to stay who you were trained to be. This isn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It's reclamation. You are not a role. You are not a projection. You are not a mirror for someone else's shame. You are a sovereign self, and you get to exist. Fully, freely, unapologetically. That tightness in your chest when you say no. That pit in your stomach when you draw a boundary. That's not proof you're wrong. That's proof the system is fading. Because guilt doesn't mean you're betraying someone. Sometimes, guilt just means you're betraying your old programming and finally choosing you. Let it happen. Let the voices rise and pass. Let the silence feel awkward and then holy. Let the part of you that was always obedient grieve its last breath. Because this is the moment you exit the system, not with a bang, but with a breath. They didn't love you too much. They needed you too obedient. And the day you stopped feeling guilty was the day you started getting free. If you're done apologizing for who healing made you become, comment. I release the guilt. I reclaim myself. And if this helped you see narcissistic guilt through a different lens, subscribe to the channel. This is where psychology stays honest, where philosophy meets the nervous system, and where the real work begins. The next video could be the step that helps it all click. So I'll see you there. But more importantly, you'll see you there.